All right, we can go ahead and get started this morning. So, way back in April of this year, Billy Camp asked me if I'd be willing to do a lesson on the summer series that was coming up, and I agreed. And he asked me what subject. Of course, he sends out a survey. He loves to send a survey. Asked what I wanted to talk about and how soon I want to do it, and I said as soon as possible because I get to worrying about these things. I don't worry about talking to y'all individually, but when y'all get together, it gets a little nerve-wracking. And so I said I wanted to cover complaining because that was one of the options that we had, and I figured I was an expert since I've got 5 kids, and it seemed like not as soon as I agreed to that topic, it just seemed like one thing after the other started happening in our family. Baby Mac had to go to the hospital, and Luke broke his femur, and then I had a knee injury, and it seemed like I had to keep going back to that lesson and saying, well, you did a lesson on complaining, and so I tried and tried and tried. It was like, I'm not going to complain, okay? And so that was a really good lesson for me. And when Dean asked me this time, he said, hey, would you be interested in doing some more lessons? I was a little gun shy. And fortunately, it's not a study on the book of Job, okay? And so it's going to be, this morning we're going to be talking about prayer. And if you grew up in the church, and even if you didn't, you probably remember one of your first memories may have been you as a little child putting your hands together and closing your eyes and praying. And y'all probably remember that little girl in class that told on you because you didn't have your eyes closed, you know. And then that might have sparked one of the first debates of your life. And you think, well, if you're telling on me for not having my eyes closed, then you didn't have your eyes closed too, you know. And so prayer is something that we can probably all remember as some of our first memories that we have. And I went to a little country school, and it wasn't a Christian school. And tell you how small and country it was. When it was deer season, I had my hunting rifle sitting. I was 16. I had my hunting rifle sitting in the middle. I have a bench seat on my truck, and it's just laid out there. And my principal called me into the office, and she said, I've got parents complaining because they can see your rifle at school. She said, just put it in the back seat where nobody can see it. She said, I know it's just deer season, you're just hunting, you know. So that tells you how small of a school that it was. But I remember in elementary school, before we would go to lunch, before we go eat anything, that we'd have a little prayer before we went. And every morning we said the Pledge of Allegiance, and every morning on the intercom, Scripture was read. And I would say for most of us in this classroom setting here, that prayer has probably been a part of your life since you can remember. And most of us can probably quote the King James Version of James chapter 5, verse 16. That's the second half of that verse. And it says, the effectual fervent prayer of a righteous man availeth much. And then the ESV version reads, the prayer of a righteous person has great power as it is working. So the Bible tells us that prayer has great power in our lives. And in 1 John chapter 5, verses 13 through 15, it says, I write these things to you who believe in the name of the Son of God, that you may know that you have eternal life. And this is the confidence that we have toward him, that if we ask anything according to his will, he hears us. And if we know that he hears us in whatever we ask, we know that we have the request that we ask of him. So we can see here in this scripture that God hears us if we ask anything according to his will. the God that created the universe and everything in it and everything that we know of, the one that made you and me, He hears our prayers, and as we see in James, our prayers are powerful. But prayer is like many things in our lives that have just been a part of our lives for as long as we can remember. We tend to take those things for granted. It's easy to take for granted the best things that God's given to us in our lives: our jobs, our spouse, our parents, our worship, God's Word, and prayer. Prayer is one of the greatest blessings that we have, but if we're not careful, we can take those blessings for granted, and we can live our lives and start praying less and less and less. Oftentimes in our lives, our blessings just become an expectations. When something is daily part of your life, we tend to take it for granted until we don't have it anymore. And I tell you one thing that I've been taking for granted for a long time, didn't even realize it, was just being able to walk normal. And until you lose something, you don't realize just how much you take that for granted. Another thing I think about is air conditioning in your home or in your car. How many of y'all grew up without air conditioning? Several hands going up. Now, the young professionals, there was only one person that raised their hand, and that was my mama. And she's professional, but so the more mature ones in this audience, y'all grew up without air conditioning. You probably have a real appreciation for it. And I imagine the first night that you spent in an air conditioner, it was really something. It has a profound effect on my life, so much so that if it's 85 degrees on a hot summer day inside of our house and they say, hey, it's going to take 2 or 3 days before somebody can repair it, we're going to go stay with somebody else for 2 or 3 days, And it's one of those things that, you don't realize how much of an effect that it has on you till it's taken out of your life. Some other things that I take for granted. The other day, my phone case was falling apart bad enough to where the buttons had fallen out to where I couldn't actually make my phone function. And I was so worried that my phone was going to break that I made a plan, for that day. Even though I had a whole list of things I needed to do, I stopped my day and I decided to go to Best Buy to get a new phone case. I was so worried it was going to get broken. And living in Hope Hole, we go the back roads to get to everything. And the Best Buy on Atlanta Highway, I think that's right, yeah, no, Eastern Boulevard, the Best Buy there, I drive in the back way, and I pull into my parking spot, and I'm getting my keys and everything, getting ready. And I look up, and I look to the left, and that Best Buy has turned into a Planet Fitness, So I walk in, I say, hey, do y'all have any phone cases left in there, And they said no. And I didn't really ask them that. But I made a trip from that location to East Chase. And if the Best Buy in East Chase had turned into a Planet Fitness, I probably would have found another place. I made it a point to go get that phone protected because I value the communication that I have with other people. It's so important to me, and our phones have become something that we feel like we have to have. But there's a lot of names in there of people that I need to be getting in contact with, either daily, weekly, or monthly. And we value the communication that we have with others. And when you think about that, and you think about how much value are we placing on our communication that we have with God, how do those two things compare? Another thing that I took for granted and didn't realize it till this situation changed was friends that I grew up with that I had in college. Whenever we graduated, we all said before we graduated, hey, we're always gonna, every year we're gonna get together, we're gonna go on a trip, we're gonna enjoy time together. And that lasted for about a year, and then, life started changing. People started moving farther away. And those relationships that we enjoyed, I can still pick up the phone and talk to those folks. And they're still my friends. But as time goes on, that relationship changed a lot. And we're never going to have that time probably where we're going to sit back on a Saturday and watch football and we're all going to be together. And our relationships change, and things in our life that gets taken from us, sometimes we don't realize the importance and the value of it until those changes and things are taken from us. So is prayer something that you have taken for granted for at some point in your life? And I would imagine that each and every one of us would say yes. And I think about what would it be like for that new Christian that had never grown up, never prayed in their life. What would it be like for that person the first time when they prayed? Would it be kind of like the first night that you spent in the air-conditioned room? And prayer is such a daily part of us that we have to be careful not to take it for granted. And I know that my prayer life, I would characterize it about like a roller coaster. It's got its ups and downs. There's times where it's been really good and times where it's not been so good. And my children, they always want us coming to school for like birthday parties, and they have like birthday lunches and things like that. We never had that growing up. I was a little bit of a class clown, so I was always a little bit nervous of my parents coming to school at all. Because, it would be like an impromptu parent-teacher conference. Hey, Miss Moore, we've been needing to talk to you for a while. And so there was some times during school that I always dreaded. And one of those was it used to be every 6 weeks, and then it turned every 9 weeks. There was a part of your report card, and it was your class conduct. And there's a scale on that, and it goes from an S+, which that was kind of like a unicorn. I had heard about them, but I'd never seen them in real life. You had to get an S+, you had to scratch the teacher's back. You had to be the teacher's pet. An S+ standing for above satisfactory. And then you had the S and the S-, and an N was a needs improvement. And then you had an N-, and I guess that means you need a lot of improvement. And then a U was unsatisfactory, and a U- was really bad, okay? You're probably going to not have a very fun summer. But when we think about that scale, when we think about from satisfactory to unsatisfactory, when we think about our prayer life, where would you consider your prayer life today? How would you rate it? And as far as our prayer life goes, we've probably in our life we've had every one of those. From a U to a S, we probably had that. We probably fell somewhere along that scale at some point. Every one of those at some point in your life. I didn't really get that out the way, but you know what I'm saying. So, as we think about where do we fall on that scale, this would be a good time for me to go ahead and give you our little challenge for the week. It'll be 3 simple goals, and they'll all involve the number 3, so it'll be easy for us to remember. But this week, I want to encourage you to pray at least 3 times a day, and that will be more of a longer prayer. And to name 3 things each day that you are thankful for. 3 new things each day that you are thankful for. So be looking for the blessings that are in your life. Be looking for those things. And that was kind of hard the first few days I tried doing this. My mom had suggested, I don't know, it's been 3 or 4 months ago, she was telling me she was doing that, and it was helping her out. I started doing that, and it's kind of tough, but the more you do it, the more you realize I'm blessed in so many ways. There's so many different opportunities and so many different ways that God's blessing me. And this week, tell 3 people that you're praying for them, or that you will be praying for them, and make it a point to pray for them throughout the week. So, kind of switching gears now, let's talk about maintenance for a minute. So maintenance it's kind of encompasses everything in our life. We have so many things in our lives that take maintenance. So some maintenance is every few months, like I think about getting an oil change, some oil change on your vehicle. I think about the monthly maintenance of paying bills, the daily maintenance of housework, and then all throughout the day, self-care and maintaining your relationships. And prayer is a big part of maintaining our relationship to God. So is your prayer life being daily maintained? If we have a strong relationship with God, we must daily and hourly maintain our prayer life. And I'll give you an example to illustrate this. So Kimberly, my wife, does such a good job of daily maintaining our house. This has been part of her daily habit for 15 years, and I'm finally starting to really appreciate that. And I'm trying to do better at helping out. But in the morning, as she's getting ready for school, she is always tidying up the house, and she's helping the kids get ready. And as soon as she walks in the door at the end of the day, that vacuum cleaner is going to cut on, and she's going to go all throughout the house and vacuum it and start organizing stuff and washing clothes. And she's daily working at maintaining the house. And when she is at the house, she's in constant motion, and she's keeping it from getting cluttered. And me, on the other hand, when I was a bachelor living in a house on my own, I tended to let things pile up until one day I said, I've had enough, and I'll spend the whole day cleaning that house up. And I would tell myself, I'm never going to let it get this way again. And then like 4 days later, we're repeating the cycle. But I didn't want to daily maintain that house. I wanted the result, but I didn't want to put in the daily work that it required to get that result. Our prayer life is like our house, and it should be daily maintained. And not just daily, but hourly. And if we don't, the cares and the burdens, just like that house, the cares and the burdens of the world can just start getting cluttered and cluttered and cluttered. And if I were to ask Kimberly, why are you so gung-ho about cleaning the house? She knows that it just takes a day when you have as many children as we do for things to just get piled up. And, we can have the same feeling in our life spiritually that the problems and troubles are just piling up if we're not constantly in study and prayer. And, do the prayers, do the cares and temptations seem to pile up on you sometime. So if we don't want the troubles of life to feel like they're piling up, prayer should be daily and hourly maintained. And that reminds me of Philippians chapter 4, verses 6 and 7. I'm going to look that up. Philippians 4, verses 6 and 7. Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything, by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Jesus Christ. So if we want peace in our lives, we see here what we should do. And we think about this passage. Who wrote these words? Paul. Paul wrote Philippians, and where was he writing these words from? From a Roman prison. Okay? So when he's saying be anxious about nothing, he had a lot of reason to be anxious and worried and scared. And so we can certainly get comfort from Paul's words when he's saying, don't be anxious about anything, but in everything, prayer and supplication. And there's so many verses in the Bible when we look at the context and we look at who's writing it and sometimes the situations they're writing it from, we should get a lot of comfort from the Word of God and the things that the people that are writing went through. So there again, prayer is such a big part of our relationship with God. And if we want to have a great relationship with God and trust in His Word and the provision that He has set for us, we will need to be daily communicating with God. We don't want to be in the situation where we only talk to God when we let big problems stack up and we feel like we need to talk to God. Prayer should not always be a 911 call. And I've noticed a pattern in my life, and you may have noticed this same type pattern in yours. When things are really stressful and life's really challenging, I pray a lot. And that's a good thing to pray a lot. But that shouldn't be the only time when I'm praying a lot, communicating with God. And then when life's going good and everything seems to be going smooth, I find myself kind of backing off of prayer. And I think, well, would there be less troubles if I would just have a better, more consistent prayer life? And when troubles do come, if my prayers are more consistent, then I know that I would be able to handle those troubles a lot better. So thinking back to James chapter 5, verse 16, where it says, "The effectual fervent prayer of a righteous man availeth much." The word fervent means having or displaying a passionate intensity. I want my prayers to be fervent and consistent in good times and in the bad times. First Thessalonians chapter 5, verses 16 through 18 says, "Rejoice always, pray without ceasing, give thanks in all circumstances." When we think about that verse, don't we want to be that kind of person? Someone who in all circumstances finds something to be thankful for. You may have a person in mind that has that kind of attitude. Don't you want to be around that kind of person? What does it mean to pray without ceasing? I think that examples I think about are going back to Kimberly. She says that all throughout the day, when they're riding in the car, they're praying. Whenever she's going on her walk, she's praying. In between classes, she's praying, and praying without ceasing just means that all day long we're communicating with God. That all these little problems or big problems that we're having throughout our day, we're able to face those through prayer all throughout the day. So daily prayer helps us to keep the daily problems in perspective, and it helps us to keep our lives from being cluttered with sins. So let's turn to James chapter 1, verses 12 through 15. James 1, 12 through 15. And it says, "Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial, for when he has stood the test of time, he will receive the crown of life, which God has promised to those who love him. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. But each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desires. Then desire, when it has conceived, gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death." So how do we remain steadfast under trial? It's that daily work and maintenance. And when the trials come, how are we prepared for those? And I think about the attorneys that worship here, and I would imagine before, when they go on a trial, they're not caught off guard because they've done a lot of preparation for that trial. And we should be the same way with the trials in our life, is that we're ready for those trials, not just because of one big thing that we did, but because of a daily and sometimes hourly maintenance, prayer, and study. And so in order for us to remain steadfast on a trial, we have to be prepared. So one of the themes several years back, or it seemed to be a theme at Del Radio, was being intentional. And that is a good, thinking about the word intentional, it's just a good reminder that the things that we need to do to be right with God are not always going to be easy, and they're not going to come naturally. But they'll take daily work, and we have to be intentional about them. The definition of steadfast is resolutely or dutifully, firm and unwavering. So being steadfast takes work. Another thing that we learn is that God will not tempt us. So when are we tempted? We're tempted when we're lured and enticed by our own desires. So how are we lured and enticed by our own desires? Let's just take a look at your typical morning. You wake up in the morning, brush your teeth, take a shower, get your clothes on, grab a bite to eat. You do this and do that. And those aren't bad things. In fact, we all have to do those things, or we should be bathing. But if we go all throughout the day doing these tasks that we have to do for life, and we're not praying and we're not studying, we're not thinking about the big picture of life, we shouldn't be surprised when temptation comes up, and we are likely to fall into temptation when all that we're thinking about is our own needs and our own desires. Sin is described by the Greek word hamartia, and I know y'all are probably thinking I'm a Greek scholar, but I'm not, in fact. So I'm probably pronouncing this word wrong. So hamartia, which means literally to miss an archery target. So sin is described as missing the mark. I've heard it said that you will never hit a target that you're not aiming for. It's pretty basic stuff. We will miss the mark if we are not intentional about our target. And daily prayer and study will help keep us on target in our life. It helps us to put things in perspective. It helps us to decipher and know what's truly important. And if you watch any TV at all, you know that there are many pharmaceutical commercials out there. And if you hear one and you hear that the list of all the side effects, you're hoping, well, maybe that next drug that they're going to have on this next commercial is going to help treat some of these side effects that these people are having. And when we think about those type things, it seems like they're not really getting to the root problem. They're not really treating the problem. They're only treating the symptoms. The temptations and sin in our life are actually just a symptom of a lack of study and prayer and a lack of submission to God. On days when temptation and sin get the best of us, days when you're snappy with your wife or husband or friends, or when you feel so overwhelmed with the busyness of the day, the days when you feel out of control, the busyness of life can have us losing sight of our priorities as Christians. On these days, taking some time to stop and pray can be a great reset for us. Earlier we mentioned praying without ceasing. 1 Thessalonians 5:16 through 18 says, "Rejoice always, pray without ceasing, give thanks in all circumstances, for this is the will of God in Jesus Christ for you." We talked about praying without ceasing, communicating with God all throughout the day. So let's take a look at Nehemiah. And in Nehemiah chapter 1, we see a good example of a long prayer for Israel. So let's read Nehemiah chapter 1, verses 2 through 6. Nehemiah 1, verses 2 through 6. Then Hananiah, one of my brothers, came with certain men from Judah, and I asked them concerning the Jews who escaped, who had survived the exile, and concerning Jerusalem. And they said to me, the remnant there in the province who had survived the exile is in great trouble and shame. The wall of Jerusalem is broke down, and its gates are destroyed by fire. As soon as I heard these words, I sat down and wept and mourned for days. And I continued fasting and praying before the God of heaven. And I said, O Lord, God of heaven, the great and awesome God who keeps covenant and steadfast love with those who love him and keep his commandments, Let your ear be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer of your servant, that I now pray before you, and night for the that I now pray before you day and night for the people of Israel, your servants, confessing the sins of the people of Israel, which we have sinned against you. Even I and my father's house have sinned. So in verse 4 there in Nehemiah, we see Nehemiah mourning and fasting and praying for days. And in verse 6, we read that Nehemiah was praying day and night. And in chapter 2, we see a good example of a short prayer. And so Nehemiah was the cupbearer to Artaxerxes. And I know y'all been studying on Wednesday night on the book of Esther. Aiden's been leading that study, and y'all talk about Xerxes there. But this is King Artaxerxes. And do y'all know what name the King Artaxerxes was also known as? Xerxes the Colder. Because Artaxerxes. Okay. Kimberly got mad at me. She's like, "You're not still telling that joke, are you?" But so Artaxerxes was the king that Nehemiah was the cupbearer to. And Nehemiah wanted to return to Jerusalem to rebuild the wall and the gates of the city and help restore Jerusalem. So let's read in Nehemiah chapter 2, verses 1 through 6. Nehemiah 2, 1 through 6. In the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of Artaxerxes, when wine was before him, I took up the wine and gave it to the king. Now I had not been sad in his presence, and the king said to me, "Why is your face sad, seeing that you are not sick? This is nothing but sadness of the heart." Then I was very much afraid, and I said to the king, "Let the king live forever. Why should not my face be sad when the city, the place of my father's graves, lies in ruin, and its gates have been destroyed by fire?" Then the king said to me, "What are you requesting?" So I prayed to the God of heaven, and I said to the king, "If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, that you send me to Judah, to the city of my father's graves, that I may rebuild it." And the king said to me, "How long will you be gone, and when will you return?" So it pleased the king to send me when I had given him a time. So we see there that Nehemiah actually had a prayer while he was in mid-conversation with the king. And we also see in chapter 1 that Nehemiah was praying steadfast. He was praying for several days, it said, and he was fasting and he was mourning. So he was praying long prayers for several days. And then when the moment came up to where he could do something about it, he prayed then to help him make the right decision. And, you know, we also see that Nehemiah was very worried and sad about this situation, but he continued in prayer. And so Nehemiah is such a good example of times of prayer in our life. We may be sad and praying for an extended period of time for something. And then we also see the example there that throughout the day that we ought to be praying about the situations. And when the situation arises, that we have the opportunity to be praying about the decisions that we need to make. So let's take a look and see how Jesus prayed in Mark chapter 1, verses 35 through 37. So Mark 1, verses 35 through 37. And rising very early in the morning, while it was still dark, he departed, and he went out to a desolate place where he prayed. And Simon and those who were with him searched for him, and they found him and said to him, "Everyone is looking for you." So we see there that Jesus got up before the sun came up. And if you're like me, I have to set an alarm clock to get up, early, and I am typically getting up pretty early. And we see there that Jesus made it a point to get up early, and the first thing that he did was to pray to God. And this is a good time for me to pray before the hustle and bustle of the day starts. When there's still some calm in the day, and that might be a great time for you to get your day started. And we see the example that Jesus gave. He prayed out in a desolate place and before the day started. So his priorities for the day were right. And I think about that being, it seems like the best time for me to get in my prayer time is before the day starts. And it really helps to set us up for a good and productive day. So let's talk about taking advantage of our time. I honestly cannot believe how fast the past 15 years have gone by. And, maybe it's flown by so fast because that's how long I've been in marital bliss. But it sounded so cliche when my parents told me when I was younger, time's really going to start flying by, especially when you get married and you have kids. And I still can't even believe that I'm considered middle-aged. I don't feel old, but I turned 40 a few weeks back. And, I don't feel like I'm getting older, but there are signs. The other day, I went to get a haircut, and this has probably been 3 or 4 months ago, and the fellow that cuts my hair, he actually lives in the house right in front of us, and he's got his own little barbershop inside of his house. And he was cutting my hair, and everything was going normal. We were talking and everything, and he was trimming the back of my neck, and I thought it was odd because I felt that trimmer graze my ear, and about the time I forgot about it, that trimmer grazed my other ear, and I thought to myself, he's doing that on purpose. One minute you're young and everything's good, and the next thing you know, you're getting your ears trimmed. Life happens quick, and I felt like the visit before, he should have sat down and explained to me, hey, Mitchell, next time you come, we're going to do some things different. A doctor will give you a heads up on something new that comes up because of your age, Been nice for you to explain it's not your fault. This is just part of life. I couldn't even make eye contact with him when I gave him the money. I just handed him money and just walked off. But life seems to be going by in chunks of time. And I listened to the radio the other day. We're under 60 days from Christmas, getting closer to less than 30 days. But when I look back on the last 15 years, there are three things that would have greatly changed my life for the better. And I wish that I had been more consistent in my prayer life. I wish I had been more consistent in my Bible study habits. I wish I had shared God's word and direction more with people. I even had really good intentions about all those things. But life has a way of getting past you. I wasn't purposefully neglecting studying the Bible and praying. I just wasn't being intentional about it. And we think about it, it's easy to miss the mark. That's the easy option. It takes daily work and intentionality to be what we are all here to be, and that is to become steadfast. And Kimberly and I were, to kind of give you another illustration of time, Kimberly and I were at a marriage retreat years ago, and one of my friends was actually leading the marriage retreat, and he had these big jars of glass beads of marbles, and he was showing, if your child was, and our son was, I think about 5 at the time, and he showed about a third of those marbles being poured out. And he said, that's how much time that you've lost with your child being under your roof at your house, and it made us sad, and now I think, well, I've got less, he would have dumped more than half of those marbles out now for my oldest son. And that visual brought 2 things to my attention. One is that our time with our children is going by really fast. And that Kimberly and I need to take advantage of every day that we have with them to nurture and influence them spiritually. And when I look back at the time that has gone by with my children, I know that there are things that I could have done to make our relationship with my children a lot better. And when we look back at our relationship with God, can we say the same thing? I think we absolutely can. And prayer is something that we will have the opportunity to take advantage for the rest of our lives. But do you ever stop and ask yourself how you have taken advantage of the time that you have? And if you're like me, you could have been so much better. And I think, how much more wisdom and clarity would I have had in my life for the span of this time if I was taking full advantage of my prayer life? How much stronger would my relationship with God be? Communication with our children and our spouse is the lifeblood of our relationship, and it is also the lifeblood of our relationship with God. We will never look back at any span of time in our lives and say, I wished I hadn't studied the Bible so much. I wished I hadn't prayed so much. So if you look back the last 15, 10, 5 years, or the past year, and you think about the habits that you wish that you had, then you're well on your way to knowing the habits that you need to start today. Proverbs chapter 4, verses 26 and 27. And, this is a simple little verse, and I like it. I think about it a lot of days. It says, "Ponder the path of your feet, then all your ways will be sure." And so in our lives, we need to be thinking about, what direction are we heading? Where are we going with these daily decisions that we have? And are we taking advantage of praying and studying the way that we should be? And I appreciate your time.